Greetings and salutations, Shalom Aleichem. I'm Stephen Aberle. I'm here speaking with Helen Mintz, translator of Vilna My Vilna, stories by Abraham Karpinowitz, or as I'm more likely to pronounce his name, and as I think he would have pronounced it, Abraham Karpinowitz. These stories originally written in Yiddish, translated by Helen into English. It is the winner of the J.I. Siegel 2016 Translation Award on a Jewish theme. It is the winner of the 2016 Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Yiddish, and it received an honorable mention for the 2017 Sophie Brody Medal for Achievement in Jewish Literature. And I say again, this is a fantastic book, really a masterful work of translation. Helen, how does it feel to win all those prizes and awards?
Well, the first response was surprise, because when you translate from Yiddish, it's kind of like choosing obscurity. So I was really surprised. Each time I was surprised and more surprised and more surprised that the book was getting all this attention. And because this translation was really, it takes a village to raise a child, and it took a village to translate this book. And as I won the awards, as the book won the awards, I was very aware, as I was personification of the recipient of them, that really there were many, many, many people who contributed to the translation. And it was a whole team. And also Yiddish literature has a lot to offer us. Prizes brought more exposure to Yiddish literature in general and to Karpinowitz specifically, which I think is a very positive thing. So yeah, great. I'm happy, thrilled.
And deservedly so. How did the book come to be? Why you, and why Karpinowitz?
Why me and why Karpinowitz? Well, I actually began the translation in an intermediate Yiddish course I was taking at YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research in New York. I think this was 2006, quite a long time ago.
Wow.
And after the course was over, the Professor Rivka Margolis, who teaches in Ottawa, approached me and she said, "You have to translate the whole book." And I was like, "No, I can't do that, and my Yiddish isn't good enough." And she emphasized that to translate Karpinowitz, I would need, no matter how good my Yiddish was, I would need the help of native from Vilna. And as she said in 2006, we're rapidly losing them. And she said, you just don't have time to wait. You have to do it. And so, I don't know, it was like a combination of commitment, naivete. I just undertook and started to do it. And Karpinowitz meets genocide with love. To me, that is such an inspiration, and an inspiration for us in these terrible times we are facing, where his focus is really on his tremendous love for the city of his birth, his love for his characters. So although he doesn't shy away from the annihilation that this Jewish Vilna and his characters experience, the fundamental underpinning of the book and of his intention is love. And that's a huge inspiration to me, and kept me going in the translation. So
that's a beautiful reflection. And it seems to me love for all of these people, and perhaps the central character, one could say, is the city itself. The city, it it becomes almost a person in itself. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to read a little piece from a memoir that's actually in this book, the very
Please
last
do.
memoir,
Please do.
if that's okay. So the memoir is called Vilna Vilna, Our Native City. And he writes, I must confess, in the name of the survivors, in the name of the small group of Vilna Jews who managed to travel to the other side and escape their native when it was converted by the murderers into one bloody Dyche Street, in the name of all those who escaped from the hellfire through forests, through camps, combat zones, and battlefronts. In the name of them all, I must confess, we were in love with Vilna. To this very day, that love pierces our hearts like a broken arrow that can't be removed without taking part of us with it.
Mm.
And that is, I think, what is motivating his feeling of love for the city of his birth and the life that he lived there. And so as a translator, I made the decision to, part of what he's doing as a writer is memorializing the specific geographic place names, the names of the streets, the alleyways, the rivers, the mountains of Jewish Vilna, and which were a different set of place names than the official Polish place names of that period, or the official Lithuanian place names of this period. And I made a decision to maintain those place names as a furthering of his of the Jewish geography of the city. And fortunately, I was working with a wonderful map maker, and there are maps in the book where you can follow the actual places, and that was very fun to do, and very fun to work with somebody who's my orientation is words, whereas his orientation was place, and it was really, it was great together for these maps.
I bet we could do an entire interview about that, but the maps really are a wonderful resource for anybody who is reading this book, and you will find it really valuable to do that. The maps and also the glossary back, which introduces us to some of the historic figures and explains some of the terms. I found in stories that we've done for Western Gold, for the Virtual Gold series, I was trying to figure out where, if I was in a particular position as the narrator is in one of the stories, in the first story that we do, where are all of these places in relation to me? And I pulled up Google Maps to try to look at some of the more distant things, and found very quickly that I could not, or because the street names bore absolutely no relation to the street names in the book, but the names in the maps that you have in the back of the book were very helpful. And you mentioned the need for a village, and your teachers telling that you better get onto these Vilna survivors quick. How important that was going to be for you. Can you talk a little bit about that? About what insights and what information you needed to get from people who had lived in Vilna?
So one of the things that I really admire about Karpinowitz is the extent to which his intention suffuses every part of his writing. Because Karpinowitz I'm told, was fluent in 10 languages, including, I'm told, English. You know, he was the director of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, so he had an international job, and a lot of his, you know, there's pictures of him with all, you know, Zubin Mehta and all kinds of, you know, major music and political figures. He was fluent in Russian. He made a decision to write in Yiddish. Karpinowitz was a post-Holocaust writer. His oeuvre really began after the Holocaust. And where, you know, Eastern European Jews had experienced the genocide. So the reading public in Yiddish was not there, or not there in any numbers. Mm-hmm. And so what he's doing in those stories is actually memorializing the language of his characters. So there's a lot of the Litvish, you know, Northern European dialect that is not necessarily, certainly when I was doing it, it was not in dictionaries. There's since been a fabulous dictionary, which I have to, for anybody who is,
my Lord.
Yeah. So this, you know, comprehensive Yiddish dictionary by Solon Beinfeld and Harry Bochner has a lot more of the vocabulary. But at the time that I was doing the translation, that dictionary didn't exist.
Wow. And
some of the words are not even in that dictionary. Another thing that Karpinowitz is doing is memorializing specific groups of vocabulary. So there's a story about a barber and extensive vocabulary about the barbering trade. There's similarly a story about a shoemaker, and there's a lot of kind of shoemaking vocabulary. There's another story that's not in this about a pool player where he's got extensive vocabulary about playing pool. And so I needed to, it was really talking to people who had lived in Vilna and who were old enough to know this vocabulary and who were able to share it with me, that was how I found a lot of the meanings of the words, and, you know, and built really amazing relationships with people. Because in the process of finding the vocabulary, people also talked about their lives. And I saw the interplay of fact and fiction in Karpinowicz's work. So, in short.
Wonderful. Well, you describe him as a post-Holocaust writer in that he was doing his writing after the Holocaust.
Right.
The stories in the book and the 4 stories that we're going to be reading for Virtual Gold are set just about immediately prior to the Holocaust. So he's writing after the fact and recalling this time before. Can you tell us a little bit about him and his life? You know, when was he born? How did he get out of Vilna, and a little bit about his story?
Sure. So Abraham Karpinowitz, and just to clarify for people, Abraham Karpinowitz that's the Yiddish pronunciation of his name. Abraham Karpinowitz is the official WorldCat pronunciation of the name. So I know him as Abraham Karpinowitz. He was born in 1913 in Vilna, and he was born into a family that was really at the center of this flowering of Yiddish culture that was taking place at that time in Vilna. His father was a major theatrical impresario. He arranged tours, through Poland and other places of major figures, including Shalom Aleichem. And he also ran a series of Yiddish theaters in Vilna itself. And that was the world that Karpinowitz grew up in, because these theaters were not money-making ventures. They were, enterprises of love. And one of the ways that theaters managed to keep going is that Karpinowitz recruited his children to play all sorts of, backstage roles. So he was, Abraham Karpinowitz was really involved in the theater from a very young age. He attended the Real Gymnasium, which was a Yiddish-speaking gymnasium in Vilna, where all major subjects were taught in Yiddish. In 1937, he left Vilna and he went to Azerbaijan, which was a Soviet socialist republic which had been set up in the frontier in Asia, a Yiddish-speaking socialist republic. So there's very little available that I've been able to find about this period of his life. We can easily deduce that he had Soviet sympathies.
Yes.
And we see that in his stories. There's a kind of knowledge of left-wing life that, and also because of that, he was not in Vilna when the Nazis invaded and murdered more than 90% of Vilna Jews. And so he survived. Like many Jews, he survived in the Soviet Union. And he returned very briefly to Vilna, and then he set out for Palestine. He spent some time in an internment camp on the island of Cyprus, where we have the first records of his writing. And then he entered the newly created state of Israel in 1948, and that's where he lived until his death in 2004.
2004.
And he worked, as I've said, as the director of the Israeli Philharmonic, and in his free time, he wrote these stories, some about early settlements, Jewish settlements in Israel, and also about Jewish life in Vilna. And he's won many awards, including the coveted Munger Prize. And again, in short.
Wow. Did you ever meet him?
No, he was no longer alive when I began the project.
But you must kind of feel him hanging around somehow.
Well, translation's an interesting process, because I did feel like, every writer wants a major audience, and he was writing in a language that did not give him a major audience. And so I felt like he kind of imagined me, that that he was with me as I was doing the translations. I felt his presence very strongly. And I was his widow, Sarah Lapitskaya. She gave me a lot of help and a lot of support. She was still alive at that time. She no longer is. And his family in general, two of Karpinowicz's nieces live in Vancouver, and one of them, Anna Gilbart, has given me a lot of help and support.
Wonderful. So you were sort of beshert. You were ordained to be together. It kind of seems.
Perhaps, yes.
So as you know, we're reading 4 of the 15 stories in this wonderful book for the Virtual Gold series. The stories that we're reading are Vilna Without Vilna, The Folklorist, Chana Merka the Fishwife, and Tol Tamara. Can you set them and the rest of the stories in the book up a little bit for us? Give us a little bit, you've touched on some of it, but a little bit more of the context of what we're reading about in these stories?
Sure. So what Karpinowitz was doing was memorializing Jewish life in Vilna in the 1930s, in the
Hmm.
period just before the Holocaust. Um, and I think it's important to know that the final solution actually began in Vilna. So when it came, people were completely unprepared.
I didn't know
Um,
that. Hmm.
so, and as I said, with love, he is memorializing that world. There was a wonderful interview done with him by Boris Sandler, who used to be the editor of the Forwards, in which Karpinowitz talks about how all the greats of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon and Max Weinreich, who was a great linguist, plenty has been written about them, but it's the ordinary Jews of Vilna who, as he said, call out for my pen. And he felt to commit, he said, they are also part of the Jewish people and they also have to be remembered. And it's those people he's memorializing, writing about, poor working people, many of whom kind of exist in some marginal relationship with legality, petty crooks and prostitutes. And so I would say and as we've already said, he's memorializing the city itself. In terms of the individual stories, Vilna on Vilna, Vilna without Vilna, which is a great story. It's a story about Mr. Jack Grossman, who owns a hotel in Canada. Interesting.
Two hotels.
Or two hotels. Oh, the second one. And years after he left Vilna, he decides to go back to search for the world of his childhood. When at that point, he was Itzik the Hare, a pickpocket. Mm. And through the eyes of the pickpocket, what he offers us is a kind of layer upon layer of absence. It's almost like a negative photograph of what's not there. And what we're seeing is the lived experience of the destruction, the annihilation of more than 90% of Vilna Jews by the Nazis. And then after the Second World War, Vilna, which had then become a part of Lithuania, was annexed by the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And the Soviets demolished many of the major Jewish landmarks, like the Great Synagogue, which was famous throughout Europe. And in this very kind of beautiful, nostalgic, but not sappy, and often humorous tone, we get that sense of the absence. Now, what's interesting is, one of the questions that I ask myself is, what is the relationship of Mr. Jack Grossman, aka Itzik the Hare, to Abraham Karpinowitz himself?
Yes, that question too.
Because he himself returned to Vilna in the period that he's talking about, where he's presenting Jack Grossman returning to Vilna. So I think he's using this character as a kind of, kind of doppelganger of himself, mm-hmm. as the person who returned to Vilna and found this incredible absence. So that's a little background for that story. Hannah Merka and the Folklorist, which are basically, it's a set of paired stories. One of the things that Karpinowitz was doing with these two stories is humanizing the work of YIVO, Institute for Jewish Research, which began in 1925 in Berlin and had such luminaries on its initial board as Freud and Einstein. It was like a big deal organization.
Wow. I didn't
And
know that.
the decision was made to send in Vilna. And the mandate of YIVO was to document Jewish life, Jewish language, all the aspects of Jewish life, especially in Eastern Europe. Without a huge amount of funds, the major way they did that was through Sammlers or collectors. So they put out a call to people to collect folk material. And we're told that thousands of people responded, including the fictional Rubinstein, the folklorist, and the fictional Chanamerka, the fishwife. And in the story Chanamerka, the fishwife, she brings the material, her own material, and then Max Weinreich, the great Yiddish linguist who wrote, a 4-volume history of the Yiddish language, is represented as receiving her what she brings with absolute delight. And so we, as the reader, we are the recipients of her collection. One of the things I love, my partner in crime in translation, Rachel Minnis, who at one point was a Chaucer scholar, sees Chanamerka as a parody of, the kind of medieval romance in which the two love to overcome obstacles in order to meet each other. And I just love that reading of it. And of course, the hero is not Jane, but Chanamerka herself. So yes, that's a little background to that story. And then Tamara, I thought about, to me, this story is just a perfect gem. So I'm reluctant to feel like, I hope that people...
No spoilers.
That's right. I hope that people just, it's really an incredibly beautiful and moving story. And I encourage people to enjoy the virtual gold presentation of it. I think I'm not going to say more about it.
Well, you've touched a little bit on this interplay between fictional and real. And as I read stories, I keep finding myself wondering, there are characters who come back again and again throughout the book, like Itzik the Hare. I don't know that we will ever know. Was there a real Itzik the Hare? Was there possibly a real Chanamerka life? I think there actually was a real Rubinstein, the folklorist, because I did some Googling and I found some references to material collected by S. Rubinstein.
Okay.
Do you have some thoughts about this play between truth and fiction, and how much is history and how much is
Well, okay, I'm going to answer that in 2 sections. So the story of Tamara, in the story of the person in the story that bears her name, we have a lot of factual details about her life, including Karpinowitz includes her full name, not her trade name, Tamara, but her name is Tamara Chemaliskia. And so I Googled the record of those Vilna Jews who were murdered in Ponar, because we know that's what happened to her. And I was not able to find any record of her. So was she completely made up? Did Karpinowitz hear stories about people like her and create a fictional character? We'll never know that. And there's a great story, Black Lake, Tamara's friend and
Mhm.
they're both prostitutes. He has another story that's not in this collection where the narrator is this, kind of older guy who's been successful living in Israel. And Black Lake, his son, who's mentioned in this story,
Helen,
comes
yes.
to Israel and contacts him and asks him if he will help him. And the narrator ends up, paying for this guy's mortgage because he has such nostalgic memories of his first sexual encounters with this. So Karpinowitz was really into playing. He was doing a lot of playing. Um, so, okay, so that, in terms of historical characters, part of what Karpinowitz was doing was he had a sense of this intimate relationship with the quote Amcha, the ordinary Jews of Vilna, and the more esteemed Jews of Vilna. How much this romanticization, how much this was actually existed, is an interesting question to look at. But throughout the stories, we see interplay. And Tal Tamara, the story Tal Tamara, for example, includes Shiomka Kagan, who was a well-known for the Vilna Tog newspaper. It includes Chaika Lunsky, who was a well-known librarian. And these characters interplay with the kind of members of the Amcha who are at the center. And this is a reversal, because usually it's the famous who are at the center, and then the masses are in the corners. Whereas Karpinowitz has done is he's put the famous in the corners at the edges, and he's put the members of the working class and the underprivileged at the center of his stories. And I think that's just a very interesting thing to do from a literary view.
I completely agree, and I wonder if you have thoughts about, you've talked about how he was this cultured intellectual who came from this very rich theatrical family background, or at least theatrical father background. Then there's such a contrast between, or there seems to be such a contrast between that and these marginalized, sometimes underworld, and often underprivileged ordinary people types that he writes about. And so much of his writing seems to have an intimate understanding of the Vilna underworld. How did he come to write about these people?
Well, yeah, it's too bad here for him to answer that question himself. But as I understand it, he has talked about and written about how the fact that he grew up in a theatrical family meant that he knew people from every class. Everyone went to the theater in Vilna. And in fact, in that same memoir that I read from previously, he's written two beautiful short memoirs about his experience in theater. And in one of them, he talks about how Sashka the Count, who was a well-known thief, had a regular seat at every. And so what Karpinowitz has said is that this relationship he had with theater put him in touch with people of every class. And because we think, unfortunately, by and large in Canada, who goes to the theater is a very select, upper class, highly educated clientele. That was not true. And as I've said earlier, Karpinowitz felt a commitment to memorialize these people whose lives had been forgotten. So.
To go on translating? Are there more Karpinowitz stories? Are there other stories? What's what's next in the Karpinowitz world for you and in the world of Yiddish translation in general?
Okay, well, just like
Whatever you
America, sorry?
whatever you can tell us.
Okay, well, just like America is bit with the folklore bug, I've been bit with the translation bug. So I have translated another collection of Karpinowitz stories, beautiful stories. In many ways, a lot of them are much more intimate portrayals. In this book, Vilna My Vilna, Karpinowitz wrote 5 collections of stories about Vilna.
Wow.
And in this collection, one of the things I was looking at was the way in which the major social and political movements, Bolshevism, Zionism,
Hmm.
Socialism, the way that they affected ordinary people. This next collection is much more intimate portraits of individuals. So that's one thing, and that's kind of stages and ready for publication.
Yay!
And yeah, it has beautiful stories in it. I translated a wonderful memoir of the orphanage that Janusz Korczak ran in the 1920s and 30s in Warsaw it was an orphanage and this was written by a man named Wasserzug, who worked in the orphanage in the late 20s and then had the good luck to emigrate to Argentina. And he talks about how the orphanage was run, incredibly progressive ideas about child rearing and education. And surprising, it's certainly surprising to me. So that I've translated that, and it will be published in Poland with a Polish translation as well, which I think is great.
Wow.
And the Janusz Korczak Association here, we're hoping to find a Canadian or a North American publisher for it as well. So that's, I don't know, like I'm also in the final stages of writing a short memoir with Karpinowitz as my inspiration, his short memoirs about my with Liebe Augenfeld, who was one of the people who gave me a lot of help. She was moved to Montreal, and it's about the help she gave me, the way in which she reflected Karpinowicz's life and the relationship she and I developed. And also, I'm looking for something else to translate. So if anyone has any suggestions, I'm open. That's pretty much what's going on for me.
From this little seed planted in your intermediate Yiddish in Yivo is growing this garden, this forest of material. So Helen, here we're reading these stories. They're set in what today we would call Vilnius, but was known to its Jewish population as Vilna in the 1930s. Very particular place and time and milieu. A person might say, well, that's all very interesting, but it's a long time ago and a long way away, and I have more pressing matters on my mind. What's the relevance? What's the resonance of these stories at a time like this?
Well, I think to start with, to meet tragedy with love, I think is a real inspiration for all of us. As you know, huge parts of our province are flooded. Areas that this very summer experienced unprecedented wildfires. And these are not accidental events. And I think Karpinowicz's attitude is something that can be an inspiration to us. the other thing I find interesting, so the 1930s was a very difficult period for everybody in Vilna. I mean, there was impoverishment of the entire population and also mounting anti-Semitism during that period. Jews discriminated against in the universities, boycotts of Jewish stores, violence on the street against Jews. And yet we see in the stories how most everybody is just going about their business as though nothing's up. You know, trying to, you know, create a little zoo in their backyard, or, you know, falling in love. And so, you know, we have a real understanding of the enormity of global warming and what it's going to do to our climate. They did not understand in the 30s that Nazism would lead to a genocide. It took longer. And yet, even with our understanding, most of us are just going about our business, you know, whatever our business is. And there's you know, I think we can look at these stories and these characters, and a lot of what Karpinowitz does is life, and then the end where the life is cut short. And would these characters have done something different had they really looked carefully at what was coming? And would we be doing something differently if we were honest to ourselves about the kind of peril that we're living in? So, so, you know, that's at a kind of level. But also, Karpinowitz is just a lot of fun to read. He had a great sense of humor. And he, you know, there's always little jokes in his little witticisms. And I think we all need joy in this period of darkness. So those are some responses to your question.
Beautiful. Well, Helen, I thank you for having written this wonderful translation. I really look forward, I hope, to seeing the publication of the other Karpinowitz stories that you've talked about, that you've translated. And I want to thank you so much for giving us your time today and telling us a little bit about that man and his work and your work, and you've got out of it, and a little bit of what you've given us. So thank you so much for being with us. And I say again, folks, buy that book. You'll be glad you did.
Okay, and if I may say, Stephen, I'm incredibly appreciative that you are, you know, doing these staged organizing and participating in these staged readings of the stories. I know I haven't seen them. I'm waiting with bated breath, but I know from your other work that they will be really wonderful. And I hope people tune into Virtual Gold and see the dramatization of these stories. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Helen. And yeah, have a wonderful time. Take care.
Okay. Happy Hanukkah, one and all.
Happy Hanukkah.